Good morning and welcome to Begin in the Word. Our text today comes from the Book of Proverbs, chapter 28, verse 17 through 18. If one is burdened with the blood of another, he will be a fugitive until death. Let no one help him. Whoever walks in integrity will be delivered, but he who is crooked in his ways will suddenly fall. This proverb is a part of a collection of proverbs that we've been studying the last few days that is found between chapter 25 and 1 through the end of chapter 29. These proverbs were collected by Hezekiah and his people. They were collected for the purpose of restoring Judah to a status where they were worshiping God. These, particularly this section that we're looking at today, has to do with the well-being of society, restoring social institutions and correcting social decay. And indeed, this section does fall within this inclusio between Proverbs chapter 28 and 12 and Proverbs chapter 29 and 27. These two bookends establish for us the parameters for which Hezekiah is going to give us proverbs that help create social well-being and help establish the institutions that are the building blocks of society, the institutions of family and government, and a workplace and other institutions that are very important to society. And so this proverb is a proverb within this collection. Now, while these proverbs do have spiritual consequences, and many of them that we've looked at are very clear, they are in the main placed here by Hezekiah for the purpose of establishing social well-being for the nation of Judah and obviously social well-being for any country, any group of people, any organization, a family, a workplace, any group that seeks to have social well-being and restored institutions. We've pointed out that the book of Proverbs is the book of wisdom. The book of Proverbs takes the law that was given by Moses, and in these laws are recited then with specific examples in the book of Proverbs to help us understand how to apply them. If the law is the data, is information and knowledge, it's the facts, the law is, then the book of Proverbs is insight and wisdom in how to keep that law. Think of it this way, the law is knowledge. These proverbs help give us wisdom in applying that knowledge, and that's the case today. The law teaches that whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. It gives us the reason why murderers must be held to account, because we are created in the image of God. And if a person sheds blood of man, his blood must be shed. It is a bulwark of the old covenant law. Well, today's teaching is a teaching on accountability for those who commit murder and the certainty of that accountability. So let's look at these phrases. The first phrase, if one is burdened with the blood of another, he will be a fugitive until death. Let no one help him. We've observed poetic structure in many of these proverbs, and this is one of the few where the poetic structure is rather weak. It is two phrases, but it's quite difficult to really lay these two phrases next to each other, and this is an indication of, Hezekiah fitting this message into this collection of proverbs, even though it doesn't really follow a strict Hebrew poetic structure guideline. It is nevertheless Hebrew poetry. It's a progressive parallel statement. This statement is saying to us that if you've been burdened with the blood of another, if you have killed somebody, if you are guilty of murder, you will be a fugitive until death. Let no one help him. There is no getting out of it. If you have committed murder, there is no reprise. And we see this from the old law, the verse we already read in Genesis chapter 9, verse 6. Because man is created in the image of God, if you take the life of a man, your life must be taken. Blood shall be shed. Exodus 21:14 repeats a similar concept where it says, but if a man willingly attacks another to kill him by cunning, you shall take him from my altar that he may die. No room of getting out of that command. Leviticus 20 verse 9, for anyone who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. He has cursed his father or his mother. His blood is upon him. Now you see this phrase quite often in the Old Testament, his blood is upon him. And what we're supposed to understand here is that when a person is put to death, their death, the accountability for their death is on their own shoulders. Let's say person A commits a crime worthy of death. When that person A stands before God, they will give account for their own death because they are the ones that committed the deed worthy of death. Now, these are just a few verses. If you go through the Old Covenant and work through the teachings on murder, putting somebody to death, or stoning somebody that has committed a crime, you will find that it very closely reflects Western law, and the reason is because Western law is based on the Old Covenant. When you hear people say that the law in our United States or in other Western cultures is dependent on the Judean-Christian ethic, this is an example of what they mean. Our laws regarding murder are very similar to the laws, or at least the concepts that are taught in the Old Testament, and they follow basically in three categories. Murder one sometimes is referred to. It means a premeditated act of murder. It involves intent. You plan to kill somebody. The reason why is irrelevant. You plan to kill them. You make preparations for that. You kill them. You have committed murder one. And this is exactly what this text is about. Let no one help him. There's no escape from that crime. Murder two is also a concept taught in the old law, and this is a crime of passion. This is something that in the heat of the moment, you become angry and act out, and your acting out causes a person to die. And this also in the Old Covenant was reason to be put to death. God expects us to maintain our emotions and not to become filled with passion and act out in ways that are ungodly. He expects that of us. Manslaughter is another part of the old law where it's negligent. An accident happens or you do something. In our world, an example of negligent homicide would be, for example, you're driving down the road and you're looking at your cell phone. You're trying to text somebody and you accidentally run into somebody and kill them. Well, that's manslaughter. That's negligent homicide, and you can go to jail for that. Typically in Western culture, you're not put to death for that, and the Old Covenant makes allowances for such a thing. But know this, that God intends for murderers to be put to death. He intends for them to pay for their sin and let no one help them. And you might say, well, what about mercy? Mercy can and must only be proffered after guilt is ascertained. Once guilt has been ascertained, there may be room for mercy based on extenuating circumstances. Indeed, in the Old Covenant, judges, kings, priests could make rulings regarding that. But first, guilt must be ascertained, and God intends the guilty to be held accountable. And this is part of what the old law did. It teaches us about sin. Now, the next phrase brings up an interesting question. It speaks to the decision-making process. It says, whoever walks in integrity will be delivered, but he who is crooked in his ways will suddenly fall. Now, these two verses go together. There's a structure that holds them together. And what Hezekiah is saying by putting these two verses together is, if you are faced with a situation where you may have to act out in violence and kill another person, you will be judged by your intent. And your intent is based on your integrity. And one of the things that's important to note before we go any further in the old law condemns murder. It's one of the 10 commandments. It's a different word for murder than it is for kill. Kill involves just the act of killing. Murder involves intent. And there's very much a difference in those two concepts. If a person is found guilty of a crime worthy of stoning, they would be put to death or they would be killed. That is not murder. But if a person grows angry at their neighbor and lashes out at them and murders them, that is murder. So sometimes we find ourselves in situations where we struggle, and we struggle with this uncertainty in areas where there are conflicting values. And so think about the police officer. The police officer goes to work in the morning and he knows he may be called upon to use force pursuant to his work. And he worries about that. He wants to make sure he's walking in integrity. And so what Hezekiah is saying here is, have your heart right. If you've got your heart right, then the right decision will be made. And this is how you wrestle with these life and death issues. If your heart is right, you'll make the right decision. If your motives are pure, That's what he's trying to say. And so many of these determinations are made based on intent. What was the intent of the person? And that's what Hezekiah is saying. Intent is everything, but know this: if your intent is bad, your crooked ways, your bad ways will be found out, and you will fall from it. You will be guilty, as we saw earlier, of the blood of another person. Now, this could be true of a police officer, maybe somebody in the military, maybe a father defending his home. There's lots of examples where this may come into play. And the teaching in this proverb is to have your heart right. Think in advance of the situations you might be faced. Think about how you could face those situations in the best way possible, and act in your integrity. Well, what's our takeaway from this text? This text is one that may not apply to us on a daily basis, but it helps us understand God's moral code. One of the things it helps us understand, first of all, is the accountability for intentional murder is absolute. When you take the life of a human being, you have taken the life of one created in the image of God, and there is no wiggle room in this guilt. It is a guilty thing, and that's why Christians are so dead set against those that commit murder, whether it is the unborn or others. Accountability for intentional murder is absolute. And to go with that, society is justified in holding murderers accountable. We need not feel bad when somebody has committed murder, an intentional act of murder, and society has determined to hold them accountable. That is in keeping with God's law. We also learn that intent is a key component of determining extenuating circumstances. And things can get pretty complicated, but when we struggle, it's when we don't understand God's law. If you have a good understanding of God's law, then these struggles between these areas of conflict tend to clear up, because we know that intent is everything. And so intent is a key component in determining these extenuating circumstances. And then finally, think ahead. If you're in one of these situations, maybe a police officer, a law enforcement agent of some type, maybe you're in the military, maybe other circumstances that might put you in a situation to have to bring violence on another person. Think ahead. Make sure your integrity is sound, that your heart is right, and make your best decision based on your integrity. You will be doing the right thing. Thanks for joining us today and begin in the Word. I hope that as you have begun today in the Word of God, you will live out today in the Word of God.